Ottawa may look like just another government city today, but beneath the polished facades of Parliament Hill and the manicured parks lies a story that's far more dramatic than you might imagine. Tonight, we'll uncover how a rough-and-tumble lumber town, carved from the wilderness, became the seat of power for an entire nation. Ottawa has weathered everything from devastating fires to political scandals, from violent labour disputes to near abandonment, all while transforming into one of the world's most unlikely capital cities. We'll begin with a surprising discovery along the Ottawa River, and from there, we'll trace the city's remarkable journey through boom and bust, conflict and compromise. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the fascinating history of Ottawa. When you think of Ottawa, you probably picture the Peace Tower rising majestically above Parliament Hill, tourists snapping photos of the changing of the guard, or perhaps the frozen expanse of the Rideau Canal in winter. This city feels purposeful, dignified, designed to be a capital. But that sense of permanence and grandeur is actually quite recent. Most of the iconic buildings that define Ottawa's skyline today weren't built until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Parliament buildings, despite their Gothic Revival architecture that seems ancient, were constructed in the 1860s. Yet the area we now call Ottawa has witnessed human activity for thousands of years. And it's also the site of discoveries that reveal a much deeper past. In recent decades, archaeological excavations throughout the Ottawa Valley have uncovered evidence of ancient settlements, burial grounds, and trading routes that paint a picture of a region that was far from empty wilderness when Europeans first arrived. Stone tools, pottery fragments, and ceremonial artifacts tell us that indigenous peoples didn't just pass through this area occasionally. They lived here, thrived here, and built complex societies here. It's remarkable to imagine that where tour buses now idle outside the National Gallery, ancient communities once gathered for seasonal ceremonies and trade gatherings that connected distant nations across the continent. However, Ottawa's recorded history truly begins with the area's indigenous inhabitants, and their story stretches back far longer than most people realise. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous peoples have lived in the Ottawa Valley for at least 6,000 years. During the Archaic period, roughly 6,000 to 3,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer societies established seasonal camps along the river systems, taking advantage of the abundant fish runs and the natural highways that waterways provided. By the Woodland period, which began around 3,000 years ago, the societies in this region had become more complex and settled. They developed sophisticated pottery techniques, established permanent villages, and created extensive trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes. The Algonquin peoples, whose descendants still live in the region today, called the river Kichisipi, meaning Great River. For them, this wasn't just a geographical feature, but a spiritual and practical lifeline that connected communities across vast distances. When French explorers first ventured up the Ottawa River in the early 1600s, they weren't entering an empty wilderness. They were entering a landscape that had been shaped by human hands for millennia, with established territories, trade routes, and diplomatic relationships that Europeans would have to navigate carefully. The river itself was already serving as one of North America's great highways, carrying people and goods between the interior and the coast. Indigenous guides and traders had perfected the art of navigating its treacherous rapids and seasonal variations. They knew every eddy, every portage, every safe camping spot along hundreds of miles of waterway. This knowledge would prove invaluable to the European newcomers, though the relationship between indigenous peoples and settlers would become increasingly complex and troubled as time went on. The first Europeans to reach the Ottawa area were French explorers and fur traders in the early 17th century. Samuel de Champlain himself travelled up the Ottawa River in 1613 and again in 1615, seeking the elusive route to the Pacific Ocean that would make France wealthy beyond imagination. But Champlain and his men quickly discovered that the Ottawa River was no easy passage. The waterway was interrupted by numerous rapids and falls that made travel dangerous and exhausting. Portages around these obstacles could stretch for miles, requiring travellers to carry their canoes and all their supplies overland through dense forest. Despite these challenges, the Ottawa River route became crucial to the fur trade that would dominate the region's economy for the next 2 centuries. French coureurs de bois and voyageurs established trading posts and temporary camps throughout the valley, creating a network of commerce that stretched from Montreal to the far reaches of the western wilderness. The area that would eventually become Ottawa served as a critical junction in this trade network. Here, several rivers converged, and the landscape provided natural stopping points where traders could rest, repair their equipment, and negotiate with Indigenous partners. For nearly 150 years, the Ottawa Valley remained a frontier region, important for trade but largely unsettled by Europeans. Occasional conflicts between French and British forces swept through the area, but these were temporary disruptions in what was essentially a wilderness economy based on extracting resources and moving them elsewhere. This began to change dramatically in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when a new industry emerged that would transform the region completely. The British Empire's insatiable demand for timber, driven by naval construction and urban growth, suddenly made the Ottawa Valley's vast forests incredibly valuable. The transition from fur trading post to lumber town didn't happen overnight, but when it did occur, it was dramatic and irreversible. In 1800, the future site of Ottawa was still largely wilderness, with only a few scattered settlements and trading posts. But by 1820, the sound of axes and saws echoed through forests that had stood undisturbed for centuries. Lumber camps sprouted along every navigable waterway, and the river that had once carried fur-laden canoes now floated massive timber rafts toward distant markets. The man most responsible for this transformation was a rough-hewn American entrepreneur named Philemon Wright. Wright had arrived in the region in 1800 with a bold vision and a group of settlers from New England. He established a community called Wrightville on the north side of the Ottawa River in what is now Hull, Quebec. Wright recognized that the Ottawa Valley contained some of the finest timber in North America. Massive white pine trees, some over 200 feet tall and perfectly straight, grew throughout the region. These giants were ideal for ship masts, construction lumber, and the countless wooden structures that the growing British Empire required. But Wright faced enormous challenges in turning this forest wealth into actual profit. The trees had to be cut down using only hand tools, shaped into manageable logs, and then somehow transported hundreds of miles to markets in Montreal and beyond. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and required a particular kind of person willing to spend months in isolated lumber camps under harsh conditions. Wright's solution was to recruit loggers from New England, Scotland, Ireland, and French Canada, creating a diverse workforce that brought different skills and traditions to the Ottawa Valley. These men lived in rough bunkhouses, worked from dawn to dusk, and faced constant dangers from falling trees, dangerous river drives, and the bitter Canadian winters. The lumber industry that Wright pioneered transformed not just the landscape, but the entire character of the region. By the 1820s, the Ottawa River had become one of the busiest commercial waterways in North America. During spring river drives, the water was choked with millions of logs floating downstream in carefully organized timber rafts that could stretch for acres. These river drives were spectacular and terrifying events. Skilled rivermen called drivers would guide the logs through rapids and around obstacles, often leaping from log to log with nothing but their balance and experience to keep them from drowning. Many didn't make it, and the river claimed dozens of lives every spring. The lumber boom created a unique culture in the Ottawa Valley, one that was rough, transient, and often violent. Lumber camps and river towns developed their own customs, their own songs, and their own ways of settling disputes. Saturday nights in lumber towns were notorious for drinking, fighting, and gambling, as men who had spent weeks in isolated camps blew off steam in spectacular fashion. This was the world that existed when government officials began looking for a location for the new province of Canada's capital city. The idea that this rough frontier region could become the seat of government seemed almost absurd to many people, but geography and politics would soon make Ottawa's transformation inevitable. By the 1850s, the lumber industry had created a substantial settlement around the Chaudière Falls, where the power of rushing water could drive the sawmills that processed logs into finished lumber. The community that grew up here was known by several names, including Bytown, named after Colonel John By, who had supervised the construction of the Rideau Canal in the 1820s. The Rideau Canal project had been another transformative event in the region's history. Conceived as a military waterway that would allow British forces to move between Montreal and Kingston without using the potentially vulnerable St. Lawrence River, the canal required massive engineering works and brought hundreds of workers to the area. Colonel By established his headquarters at the junction of the Ottawa River and the Rideau Canal, and the settlement that grew up around his operations became the nucleus of what would eventually become Ottawa. The canal project was completed in 1832, but by then, Bytown had developed its own momentum as a lumber town and regional trading centre. The town that emerged was a fascinating mixture of rough lumber camps and increasingly sophisticated urban amenities. Wealthy lumber barons built impressive mansions overlooking the river, while their workers lived in crowded boarding houses and rough neighbourhoods that could erupt into violence with little provocation. Religious and ethnic tensions added another layer of complexity to Bytown's social fabric. Irish Catholic loggers clashed with Protestant workers, French-Canadian voyageurs maintained their own cultural traditions, and Indigenous peoples found themselves increasingly marginalised as the forest economy displaced traditional ways of life. Despite these tensions, or perhaps because of them, Bytown developed a reputation as one of the most dynamic and unpredictable places in British North America. Fortunes were made and lost with stunning speed, political careers were built on lumber wealth, and the constant influx of newcomers kept the community in a state of perpetual change. This was the unlikely foundation upon which Canada's future capital would be built. The selection of Ottawa as the national capital would require transforming a lumber town known for its rough edges into a city worthy of hosting a new nation's government, a challenge that would test the community's ability to reinvent itself completely. The transformation from lumber town to potential capital didn't happen by accident. It was the result of a political crisis that had been brewing for decades in the province of Canada, a union of what are now Ontario and Quebec that had been created in 1840. The problem was simple, but seemingly impossible to solve. Where should the capital be located? Montreal had been the obvious choice for years, serving as the commercial heart of British North America and home to the colony's most powerful merchants and politicians. But Montreal's selection had created resentment in other regions, particularly among English-speaking settlers who viewed the city as too French and too Catholic. Toronto, known then as York, had served as the capital of Upper Canada and had strong support from the growing English-speaking population. But French Canadians saw Toronto as a symbol of British dominance and refused to accept it as a permanent seat of government. Kingston had briefly served as capital in the 1840s, but its location on Lake Ontario made it feel too remote from the centres of population along the St. Lawrence River. Quebec City had historical significance, but seemed too far from the expanding western regions of the colony. For more than a decade, the colonial government had rotated between different cities, moving every few years in an exhausting and expensive attempt to satisfy competing regional interests. Government clerks spent months packing and unpacking files, politicians complained about the constant disruption, and the whole system seemed to exemplify everything that was dysfunctional about colonial politics. By the 1850s, pressure was mounting to find a permanent solution. The colony was growing rapidly, new railways were connecting distant regions, and there was talk of an even larger confederation that might include the maritime provinces and the Western Territories. A permanent capital wasn't just a convenience anymore. It was becoming essential for effective governance. The decision ultimately fell to Queen Victoria herself, though she was guided by colonial officials who understood the political realities better than she did. When the request for a ruling reached London in 1857, the Queen's advisors faced the same impossible choice that had paralysed colonial politicians for years. The solution they arrived at was both brilliant and completely unexpected. Instead of choosing one of the established cities with their entrenched interests and bitter rivalries, they selected a lumber town that nobody had seriously considered as a contender. Ottawa, still officially known as Bytown until 1855, offered several advantages that weren't immediately obvious to most observers. Its location on the border between Upper and Lower Canada meant it could serve both English and French populations without clearly favouring either. The city was far enough from the American border to be defensible in case of war, but close enough to major population centres to be accessible. Perhaps most importantly, Ottawa had no powerful political establishment that might resist federal authority. Unlike Montreal or Toronto, where wealthy merchants and established families had built networks of influence over generations, Ottawa was still a frontier community where new institutions could be created without having to displace old ones. The announcement of Ottawa's selection was met with shock and dismay in most established political circles. Newspapers in Montreal and Toronto ridiculed the choice, calling Ottawa a backwoods lumber village unsuitable for dignified government functions. Critics pointed out that the city lacked adequate hotels, proper roads, and even basic urban amenities that visiting dignitaries would expect. But the decision had been made, and now Ottawa faced the extraordinary challenge of transforming itself from a rough lumber town into a capital city worthy of representing British North America on the world stage. The transformation began almost immediately, though it would take decades to complete. Government architects were dispatched to design buildings that would project the proper image of British authority and democratic governance. The Gothic Revival style was chosen for the main Parliament buildings, a decision that would give Ottawa its distinctive skyline and architectural character. Construction began on Parliament Hill in 1859, but the project was plagued by delays, cost overruns, and technical challenges. Building on the bluff overlooking the Ottawa River required massive foundations and careful engineering to prevent the structures from sliding toward the water. Stone had to be quarried from sites outside the city and transported by railway and wagon over rough roads. The work attracted skilled craftsmen from across North America and Europe, adding yet another layer to Ottawa's increasingly diverse population. Scottish stonemasons worked alongside Irish carpenters and French-Canadian labourers, creating a construction community that reflected the multicultural character of the emerging nation. Meanwhile, the existing lumber town continued to operate around the construction sites. The sound of hammers and saws working on government buildings mixed with the familiar noises of sawmills and timber rafts. Lumber barons who had built their fortunes on white pine now found themselves hosting government officials and foreign diplomats in their riverside mansions. The contrast was often jarring. Elegant carriages carrying cabinet ministers had to navigate streets that were still largely unpaved and often impassable during spring thaws. Government clerks in formal attire worked in temporary offices, while construction noise echoed from nearby building sites. This period of transition revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of Ottawa's rapid transformation. The city was growing quickly, but growth often came at the expense of planning and coordination. New neighbourhoods sprouted without adequate infrastructure, while established areas struggled to adapt to their changing role. The lumber industry that had created Ottawa continued to dominate the local economy, even as government functions expanded. This created a unique dynamic where federal civil servants and lumber workers lived side by side, often in the same neighbourhoods and sometimes in the same boarding houses. The completion of the Parliament buildings in 1866 marked a crucial milestone in Ottawa's evolution, but it also highlighted how much work remained to be done. The buildings themselves were magnificent, their Gothic towers and elaborate stonework creating an impressive symbol of national ambition. But the surrounding city still bore clear marks of its frontier origins. Streets were often muddy quagmires during spring and fall, while clouds of dust choked pedestrians during dry summer months. Sewage systems were primitive or non-existent in many areas, creating health hazards that embarrassed officials trying to project an image of modern governance. The Ottawa River, which had always been central to the city's identity, remained a working waterway dominated by timber rafts and industrial activity. The romantic image of a capital city built along a majestic river was complicated by the reality of sawmill waste, log booms, and the seasonal chaos of spring river drives. Yet even as Ottawa struggled with these practical challenges, the city was beginning to develop the institutions and culture that would define its character for generations to come. Government departments established their headquarters in permanent buildings, creating stable employment for thousands of civil servants who formed the core of a new middle class. Cultural institutions began to emerge as well, reflecting Ottawa's new status and the cosmopolitan backgrounds of its residents. Libraries, schools and churches were built to serve the growing population, while newspapers and social clubs provided forums for political discussion and community organisation. The arrival of railway connections in the 1850s and 1860s had linked Ottawa to the broader North American transportation network, making it possible for goods and people to travel between the capital and major cities like Montreal and Toronto in a matter of hours rather than days. This improved connectivity was crucial for Ottawa's success as a capital city, but it also accelerated changes that were already reshaping the lumber industry that had created the community in the first place. Railways brought more than just improved transportation to Ottawa. They fundamentally altered the economics of the lumber industry that had dominated the region for decades. Suddenly it became possible to ship finished lumber products directly to markets across North America, bypassing the traditional river routes that had channeled everything through Montreal. This shift had profound implications for Ottawa's timber barons, who found themselves competing not just with other Canadian producers, but with lumber companies from Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Pacific Northwest. The massive white pines that had made the Ottawa Valley famous were becoming increasingly scarce after decades of intensive harvesting, while new forests in the American Midwest offered seemingly unlimited supplies of timber. Some lumber companies adapted by diversifying into paper production, taking advantage of the same water power that had driven their sawmills for generations. The transition from lumber to pulp and paper would eventually transform the Ottawa Valley's economy once again, but this change would unfold gradually over several decades. Meanwhile, the completion of Confederation in 1867 brought new responsibilities and opportunities to Ottawa. What had been the capital of the province of Canada was now the seat of government for an entire nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This expanded role required not just larger government buildings, but a complete reimagining of Ottawa's purpose and identity. The early years of Confederation tested Ottawa's capacity to serve as a national capital in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. Members of Parliament arrived from distant provinces with different customs, languages, and expectations about how government should operate. The city's hotels and boarding houses struggled to accommodate the influx of politicians, lobbyists, and visitors who descended on the capital during parliamentary sessions. Social tensions that had simmered beneath the surface during Ottawa's Lumbertown days became more pronounced as the city tried to present a dignified face to the world. The rough neighbourhoods where lumber workers lived seemed increasingly out of place next to the grand government buildings, yet these communities remained essential to the local economy. Religious and ethnic divisions that had characterised frontier Ottawa persisted even as the city took on national significance. Irish Catholic lumber workers still clashed with Protestant settlers, while French Canadian residents found themselves caught between their traditional culture and the increasingly English character of federal institutions. The government's attempts to create a proper capital city atmosphere often collided with the practical realities of a community that was still heavily dependent on resource extraction. Timber rafts continue to clog the Ottawa River during spring drives, creating spectacular traffic jams that could strand government officials trying to cross between Ottawa and Hull. These contradictions became particularly evident during major state occasions when foreign dignitaries visited the new Dominion's capital. Elaborate ceremonies on Parliament Hill proceeded while the sounds and smells of sawmills drifted across the river, creating a uniquely Canadian mixture of pomp and industrial pragmatism. The 1870s and 1880s saw determined efforts to address these challenges through ambitious urban planning projects. The federal government commissioned landscape architects to design park systems that would provide appropriate settings for the capital's growing collection of public buildings. Major thoroughfares were widened and paved, while new bridges connected different parts of the expanding city. One of the most significant developments during this period was the construction of the Rideau Canal's recreational facilities. What had been conceived as a military waterway gradually evolved into one of Ottawa's most distinctive features, providing both practical transportation and scenic beauty in the heart of the capital. The canal's transformation reflected broader changes in how Ottawa understood its own identity. The city was beginning to embrace its unique history rather than trying to hide its frontier origins. Lumber industry heritage became a source of pride rather than embarrassment, while the dramatic natural setting of the Ottawa River Valley was recognised as an asset that distinguished the Canadian capital from other government centres around the world. This growing confidence in Ottawa's distinctive character coincided with significant demographic changes that were reshaping the city's social fabric. The expansion of federal government operations created thousands of new jobs for clerks, translators, and administrators, attracting educated workers from across Canada and beyond. Many of these new residents were bilingual, reflecting the practical necessity of conducting government business in both English and French. This linguistic diversity became one of Ottawa's defining characteristics, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that distinguished the capital from more homogeneous communities elsewhere in Canada. The arrival of new railway lines in the 1880s accelerated these demographic shifts by making Ottawa more accessible to immigrants from Europe and other parts of North America. Italian stonemasons came to work on government building projects. German craftsmen established workshops and small factories, and Jewish merchants opened stores that served the growing middle-class population. Each wave of newcomers added to Ottawa's cultural complexity, while also creating new tensions and opportunities. Established residents sometimes resented the competition from immigrant workers, while newcomers struggled to find their place in a community that was itself still defining its identity. The lumber industry that had created Ottawa continued to provide employment for thousands of workers, but its character was changing rapidly. The era of massive timber rafts floating down the Ottawa River was drawing to a close as the most accessible forests became depleted, and transportation patterns shifted toward railways. Some lumber companies responded by moving their operations further north, following the retreating tree line into areas that had previously been too remote to harvest profitably. Others invested in new technologies that allowed them to process smaller trees and previously unusable species, extending the life of forests that had been partially cut over. The most successful lumber barons diversified into other industries, using their accumulated capital and political connections to establish banks, railways, and manufacturing enterprises. These business leaders formed the core of Ottawa's emerging economic elite, families whose influence would shape the city's development for generations. Their mansions began to dot the bluffs overlooking the Ottawa River, creating prestigious neighbourhoods that rivaled anything in Montreal or Toronto. These grand homes served not just as private residences, but as venues for the social gatherings that were becoming increasingly important to Ottawa's role as a national capital. The contrast between these elegant districts and the working-class neighbourhoods where most residents lived became more pronounced as the city grew. Lumber workers, government clerks, and immigrant families crowded into areas that lacked the basic services that wealthy residents took for granted. Sewage systems remained primitive in many parts of the city well into the 1880s, creating health hazards that periodically erupted into serious epidemics. Cholera outbreaks struck several times during this period, claiming hundreds of lives and highlighting the urgent need for better public infrastructure. Fire was another constant threat in a city where most buildings were still constructed primarily of wood. Major conflagrations swept through Ottawa's business district multiple times during the 1870s and 1880s, destroying entire blocks and forcing repeated reconstruction of commercial areas. These disasters often revealed the extent to which Ottawa remained divided along economic and ethnic lines. Wealthy residents could afford to rebuild quickly using brick and stone, while working-class families often found themselves permanently displaced by fires that destroyed their neighbourhoods. The federal government gradually took a more active role in addressing these urban challenges, recognising that the capital city's problems reflected on the entire nation. Public works projects funded by federal spending began to transform Ottawa's infrastructure, while new regulations governing building standards and public health created a framework for more orderly development. The establishment of a professional fire department, improved water systems, and better street lighting made Ottawa a safer and more livable city, though progress was often slow and uneven across different neighbourhoods. These improvements coincided with cultural developments that were giving Ottawa a more sophisticated character. The opening of professional theatres, concert halls, and art galleries provided entertainment options that went beyond the saloons and gambling houses that had dominated the Lumbertown's nightlife. Educational institutions also flourished during this period, as both the federal government and religious organisations established schools and colleges that served the capital's growing population. The University of Ottawa, founded by Catholic missionaries, became one of the few bilingual universities in North America, reflecting the city's unique linguistic character. These developments created opportunities for women that had been largely absent during Ottawa's frontier period. Teaching, nursing, and clerical work in government offices provided respectable employment for educated women, while the city's growing cultural institutions offered venues for female participation in public life. The 1880s also saw the emergence of organised labour movements that would play an increasingly important role in Ottawa's political landscape. Lumber workers, who had always been among the most militant segments of the workforce, began forming unions that could challenge the power of mill owners and government contractors. These early labour organisations faced fierce opposition from employers who were accustomed to operating with minimal interference from workers. Strikes and lockouts became common features of Ottawa's industrial life, creating tensions that sometimes spilled over into violence. The federal government found itself in an awkward position during these labour disputes, trying to maintain neutrality while also ensuring that essential government services continued to operate. The capital city's role as both a centre of political power and an industrial community created conflicts of interest that would persist for decades. As Ottawa entered the 1890s, the city had successfully established itself as Canada's permanent capital, but the process of transformation was far from complete. The lumber industry that had created the community was entering a period of decline, while new industries and institutions were still developing their permanent character. The challenge facing Ottawa's leaders was how to manage this transition while maintaining the economic vitality and cultural diversity that had made the city's rapid growth possible in the first place. The 1890s brought new challenges that would test Ottawa's resilience in ways the community had never experienced before. The city that had grown accustomed to steady expansion suddenly faced the prospect of economic stagnation as its founding industry began its inevitable decline. The great white pine forests that had made fortunes for lumber barons like Philemon Wright were becoming memories. Decades of intensive harvesting had stripped the most accessible timber from the Ottawa Valley, forcing logging operations to venture ever deeper into the northern wilderness. What remained closer to the city were smaller trees and less valuable species that couldn't generate the massive profits of the Golden Age. This shift wasn't just about economics. It represented a fundamental change in Ottawa's relationship with the landscape that had created it. The sound of axes echoing through ancient forests was giving way to the quieter hum of paper mills and the steady rhythm of government offices. The river that had once carried spectacular timber rafts now hosted pleasure boats and ferry services for civil servants commuting between Ottawa and Hull. Some long-time residents mourned these changes, viewing them as the end of an era when Ottawa had been a place where ordinary men could make extraordinary fortunes through hard work and calculated risks. Others welcomed the transformation, seeing it as evidence that their city was finally growing beyond its rough frontier origins. The lumber barons themselves faced difficult choices about their own futures. Some, like the Bronson family, successfully diversified their investments into railways, banks, and real estate development. They used their accumulated wealth and political connections to position themselves as leaders of Ottawa's emerging industrial economy. Others struggled to adapt to changing conditions. Mills that had operated profitably for decades suddenly found themselves competing with more efficient operations in British Columbia and the American South. Family businesses that had passed from father to son for generations were sold to larger corporations or simply abandoned as unprofitable. The workers who had depended on the lumber industry faced even more difficult transitions. Skilled river drivers and timber cruisers found their specialized knowledge increasingly obsolete as the industry mechanized and moved away from traditional techniques. Many were forced to seek work in Ottawa's growing construction industry or the expanding government bureaucracy. This economic transformation was complicated by rapid technological changes that were reshaping urban life across North America. Electric lighting began replacing gas lamps on Ottawa's main streets, creating a more modern atmosphere, but also requiring substantial investments in new infrastructure. The introduction of electric streetcars in the 1890s revolutionized transportation within the city, making it possible for workers to live farther from their jobs and enabling the development of new residential neighbourhoods on Ottawa's periphery. These suburban areas attracted middle-class families who could afford the convenience of streetcar commutes while escaping the noise and pollution of the city centre. Telephone systems connected government offices and wealthy residences, speeding communication, but also creating new social divisions between those who could afford modern conveniences and those who remained dependent on older methods of staying in touch. The federal government's role in Ottawa's development became more pronounced during this period as politicians and civil servants recognized that the capital city's appearance and functionality reflected on the entire nation. Major public works projects funded by federal spending began transforming Ottawa's infrastructure in ways that would have been impossible during the Lumbertown era. The construction of new government buildings accelerated throughout the 1890s as departments that had been housed in temporary quarters finally received permanent facilities. The distinctive architecture of these structures helped establish Ottawa's visual identity as a seat of government, while their construction provided employment for hundreds of skilled craftsmen. The Langevin block, completed in 1889, housed several government departments and demonstrated the federal commitment to creating a proper administrative capital. Its Second Empire architectural style reflected contemporary European influences, while its substantial construction suggested permanence and stability. Similar investments in cultural institutions reinforced Ottawa's growing sophistication. The opening of the Russell Theatre in 1897 provided a venue for touring companies and local productions, while improvements to existing facilities like the Grand Opera House attracted performers from across North America. These developments created a social calendar that revolved around government sessions and cultural events, rather than the seasonal rhythms of the lumber industry. Parliamentary sessions brought hundreds of visitors to the city, filling hotels and boarding houses, while generating business for local merchants and service providers. The social dynamics of this transformed Ottawa were complex and often contradictory. Government officials and their families formed an increasingly influential elite that set standards for proper behaviour and cultural sophistication. Their dinner parties and receptions became important venues for political networking and social advancement. Yet this emerging establishment coexisted uneasily with the working-class communities that had been Ottawa's foundation during the lumber era. Irish Catholic neighbourhoods maintained their own cultural traditions and political loyalties, while French Canadian residents found themselves caught between their historical roots and the increasingly English character of federal institutions. These tensions occasionally erupted into public conflicts that embarrassed civic leaders trying to project an image of harmonious progress. Labour strikes at construction sites and manufacturing plants disrupted the orderly atmosphere that government officials preferred, while ethnic and religious disputes sometimes spilled over into violence. The most serious of these incidents occurred in 1897, when conflicts between Protestant and Catholic workers at a government construction site escalated into several days of street fighting that required intervention by federal authorities. The episode highlighted the extent to which Ottawa's rapid transformation had failed to resolve underlying social divisions. Despite these challenges, the 1890s established patterns of development that would shape Ottawa's character for decades to come. The city's dual identity as both a government centre and an industrial community created unique opportunities for economic diversification, while also generating persistent tensions between different visions of what the capital should become. Manufacturing industries began establishing operations in Ottawa during this period, taking advantage of the city's railway connections and proximity to government markets. Firms producing everything from furniture to machinery found that location in the capital provided advantages in securing government contracts, while also offering access to skilled workers displaced from declining lumber operations. The emergence of these new industries created employment opportunities for immigrants arriving from Europe and other parts of Canada. Italian families established themselves in construction and stonework, while Jewish merchants opened shops that served both government workers and industrial labourers. Each wave of newcomers added complexity to Ottawa's social fabric, while also contributing to the city's economic vitality. Immigrant communities often clustered in particular neighbourhoods, creating ethnic enclaves that maintained old world traditions while adapting to Canadian conditions. These demographic changes were reflected in the expansion of religious institutions that served diverse populations. New churches, synagogues, and schools were built to meet the needs of communities that hadn't existed during Ottawa's Lumbertown days. The Catholic Church remained particularly influential, serving both French-Canadian and Irish populations, while also ministering to newer immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe. The construction of new parishes and schools demonstrated the Church's commitment to maintaining its role in Ottawa's evolving community. Protestant denominations also expanded their presence, establishing congregations that often reflected both ethnic and class divisions within the broader population. Presbyterian churches served Scottish immigrants and government officials, while Methodist and Baptist congregations attracted English-speaking workers and their families. These religious communities provided more than just spiritual guidance. They offered social services, educational opportunities, and networks of mutual support that helped newcomers adapt to urban life. Church-sponsored organisations created venues for community involvement, while also reinforcing cultural boundaries between different groups. The educational system that emerged during this period reflected Ottawa's unique character as a bilingual capital city. Schools operated in both English and French, while the University of Ottawa developed programs that prepared students for careers in government service as well as traditional professions. This emphasis on bilingual education created opportunities for linguistic minorities, while also generating controversies about language rights and cultural identity. Debates about school curricula and language of instruction became proxies for broader tensions about Ottawa's evolving character. Women's roles in Ottawa society began changing significantly during the 1890s as new employment opportunities emerged in government offices and expanding service industries. The federal civil service, though still dominated by men, began hiring women for clerical positions that required literacy and attention to detail. These jobs offered middle-class women alternatives to teaching and domestic work, while providing them with unprecedented economic independence. Female government clerks formed social organisations that advocated for workplace improvements, while also participating in broader movements for women's rights. The presence of educated working women in Ottawa contributed to the city's growing cultural sophistication, while also challenging traditional assumptions about gender roles. Women's organisations became increasingly active in promoting social reforms and cultural activities that enhanced the capital's reputation. As the 19th century drew to a close, Ottawa had successfully negotiated the transition from lumbertown to capital city, but the process had revealed fundamental questions about the community's future direction. The federal government's growing presence provided economic stability and cultural opportunities, yet many residents remained ambivalent about their city's transformation. The lumber industry that had created Ottawa continued to employ thousands of workers, but everyone understood that this economic foundation was gradually eroding. Paper mills and other forest-based industries offered some hope for continuity, but they required different skills and provided fewer opportunities for the kind of spectacular individual success that had characterized the timber era. Meanwhile, Ottawa's role as national capital was becoming more demanding as Canada's responsibilities expanded both domestically and internationally. The city that had once seemed adequate for governing a collection of British colonies now needed to represent a nation with growing ambitions on the world stage. The challenge facing Ottawa's leaders as they entered the new century was how to build on the foundations established during the 1890s while adapting to rapidly changing conditions both within Canada and around the world. The lumber town that had become a capital city would soon discover that its transformation was far from complete. The approaching 20th century promised new technologies, new industries, and new social movements that would test Ottawa's capacity for continued adaptation. The community that had reinvented itself once would need to do so again, drawing on lessons learned during its remarkable journey from frontier settlements to seat of government. Yet the patterns established during the 1890s provided reasons for optimism about Ottawa's future prospects. The city had demonstrated an remarkable ability to attract diverse populations, adapt to changing economic conditions, and maintain its distinctive character while embracing necessary changes. The lumber camps and timber rafts were becoming memories, but the spirit of innovation and determination that had built Ottawa from wilderness remained very much alive. As the new century approached, residents could look back with pride on their community's achievements while anticipating the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The dawn of the 20th century found Ottawa poised between worlds, neither fully the rough lumber town it had been, nor quite the sophisticated capital it aspired to become. The new century would bring challenges that would test every aspect of the community's resilience and adaptability. The first major crisis came not from economic forces or political upheaval, but from nature itself. On April 26, 1900, a devastating fire swept through Hull and threatened to consume Ottawa as well. The blaze began in a lumberyard across the river and quickly spread through the working-class neighbourhoods that housed thousands of mill workers and their families. For hours it seemed as though the flames might leap the Ottawa River and destroy the Parliament buildings themselves. Government officials watched in horror from the windows of their offices as entire districts disappeared in clouds of smoke and ash. The fire burned for 3 days, destroying more than 3,000 buildings and leaving nearly 15,000 people homeless. The disaster revealed both the vulnerability of Ottawa's wooden infrastructure and the strength of its emerging civic institutions. Relief efforts organised by government officials, religious leaders, and prominent citizens provided shelter and assistance to thousands of displaced residents. The federal government authorised emergency funds for reconstruction, while private donations poured in from across Canada. But the fire also exposed deep inequalities in how different parts of the community experienced both disaster and recovery. Wealthy residents in stone and brick mansions suffered minimal damage, while working-class families lost everything they owned. Insurance companies often refused to pay claims in the hardest-hit areas, leaving many families with no resources for rebuilding. The reconstruction process that followed transformed both Hull and Ottawa in ways that went far beyond simply replacing destroyed buildings. New building codes required fire-resistant materials in commercial districts, while improved water systems and professional fire departments provided better protection against future disasters. More importantly, the fire accelerated ongoing changes in Ottawa's economic structure. Many of the destroyed lumber mills were never rebuilt, as owners decided to invest their insurance settlements in other industries or simply retire from business altogether. The disaster marked a symbolic end to the era when timber dominated the Ottawa Valley's economy. The federal government seized the opportunity to expand its presence in areas cleared by the fire, purchasing land for new government buildings and parks that would enhance the capital's appearance. These acquisitions began a process of federal involvement in Ottawa's urban planning that would continue for decades. Meanwhile, technological innovations were reshaping daily life in ways that would have seemed impossible during Ottawa's frontier period. Electric power systems expanded throughout the city, bringing modern lighting to residential neighbourhoods and powering new manufacturing enterprises that didn't depend on water power from the river. The introduction of electric streetcars revolutionised urban transportation, making it possible for workers to live in suburban neighbourhoods while commuting to jobs in the city centre. This development encouraged the growth of new residential areas that catered to the expanding middle class of government employees and skilled tradesmen. Automobile ownership remained rare before 1910, but the few motor cars that appeared on Ottawa's streets created excitement and controversy. These mechanical marvels fascinated some residents, while frightening others who worried about their impact on horses and pedestrians. The telephone system that had begun serving wealthy residents and government offices during the 1890s expanded rapidly in the new century, connecting businesses and middle-class homes while creating new forms of social interaction. Party lines allowed neighbours to eavesdrop on each other's conversations, creating both entertainment and social tensions in residential neighbourhoods. These technological changes coincided with significant shifts in Ottawa's demographic composition. Immigration from Europe accelerated as steamship travel became more affordable, and Canadian immigration policies encouraged settlement. Italian stonemasons, German craftsmen, and Jewish merchants joined the existing mix of English, French, Irish, and Scottish residents. Each immigrant community brought distinctive cultural traditions while also adapting to Ottawa's unique bilingual character. Italian families established themselves in construction trades, building many of the stone and brick structures that replaced wooden buildings destroyed in the 1900 fire. German immigrants opened breweries and mechanical workshops that served the city's growing industrial sector. The Jewish community, though small, played an increasingly important role in Ottawa's commercial life. Jewish merchants established stores along Rideau Street and Spark Street, serving both government workers and working-class families, while maintaining their own religious and cultural institutions. These demographic changes created new social dynamics that sometimes challenged established patterns of community life. Traditional divisions between Protestant and Catholic, English and French remained important, but were complicated by the presence of newcomers who didn't fit neatly into existing categories. The expansion of government operations during the early 20th century provided employment opportunities that attracted educated workers from across Canada and beyond. The federal civil service grew rapidly as new departments were created to address the challenges of governing an expanding nation. These government jobs offered security and respectability that appealed particularly to middle-class families seeking stable careers. Civil service positions often required bilingual skills, creating advantages for French Canadians and immigrants who had learned multiple languages. The growing importance of government employment began to change Ottawa's social structure in fundamental ways. Civil servants formed professional associations that advocated for better working conditions and pension benefits, while their families created social networks that centred around government activities rather than industrial or commercial enterprises. This emerging bureaucratic class developed its own cultural institutions and social customs that distinguished Ottawa from other Canadian cities. Government receptions and official ceremonies became important features of the capital's social calendar, while civil service clubs and associations provided venues for professional networking and leisure activities. The expansion of federal operations also attracted businesses that specialised in serving government needs. Printing companies, office supply firms, and professional services established operations in Ottawa to take advantage of proximity to major customers. These enterprises provided additional employment while diversifying the local economy beyond its traditional resource base. Educational institutions evolved to meet the changing needs of Ottawa's population during this period. The University of Ottawa expanded its programs to include professional training for government careers, while technical schools prepared workers for employment in the city's growing manufacturing sector. The separate school systems that served Protestant and Catholic populations continued to operate in both English and French, reflecting Ottawa's unique linguistic character. However, debates about language of instruction and curriculum content became increasingly contentious as different communities sought to maintain their cultural identity while preparing children for success in a changing economy. Women's roles in Ottawa society continued to evolve as new employment opportunities emerged in government offices and expanding service industries. Female clerks, typists, and telephone operators became common figures in the city's business districts, though they typically earned less than their male counterparts and faced restrictions on advancement. These working women formed organisations that advocated for workplace improvements while also participating in broader movements for social reform. The Ottawa Local Council of Women, established in 1893, became increasingly active in promoting causes ranging from public health improvements to women's suffrage. The presence of educated, economically independent women in Ottawa contributed to the city's growing cultural sophistication, while also challenging traditional assumptions about gender roles and family structure. Women's clubs sponsored lectures, concerts, and charitable activities that enhanced the capital's cultural life. Religious institutions adapted to serve Ottawa's changing population while maintaining their traditional roles in community life. The Catholic Church continued to serve both French Canadian and Irish populations, while also ministering to newer immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe. Protestant denominations established new congregations that reflected the city's expanding geographic boundaries and increasingly diverse membership. These churches provided not only spiritual guidance, but also social services and community networks that helped newcomers adapt to urban life. The construction of new church buildings during this period reflected both growing congregations and increased prosperity among Ottawa's established residents. Gothic revival and Romanesque architectural styles dominated religious construction, creating landmarks that complemented the city's government buildings. Cultural institutions flourished as Ottawa's population grew and became more prosperous. The Russell Theatre hosted touring productions from New York and London, while local musical societies performed works that ranged from popular songs to classical compositions. Libraries expanded their collections and services to meet the needs of an increasingly literate population, while museums and art galleries began collecting artifacts that documented Ottawa's history and Canada's cultural development. These cultural amenities attracted visitors from other Canadian cities and helped establish Ottawa's reputation as more than just a government centre. The capital was developing its own intellectual and artistic community that contributed to national conversations about literature, art, and public policy. Sports and recreation became increasingly important aspects of Ottawa life as residents gained more leisure time and disposable income. Hockey emerged as a particularly popular winter activity, with local teams competing in organised leagues that attracted enthusiastic crowds. The Ottawa River provided opportunities for summer recreation that took advantage of the city's natural setting. Boating, swimming, and picnicking became popular activities that brought together residents from different social and economic backgrounds. Parks and recreational facilities developed during this period reflected the influence of City Beautiful movement ideas about urban planning. Federal authorities began creating parkland along the Ottawa River, while municipal governments established neighbourhood parks that served residential areas. These recreational developments enhanced Ottawa's appeal as a place to live, while also providing venues for community activities that brought together residents from different backgrounds. Sports clubs, picnic associations, and recreational societies became important parts of the city's social fabric. The lumber industry that had created Ottawa continued to provide employment for thousands of workers, but its character was changing rapidly as easily accessible forests became depleted and market conditions shifted. Many mills converted to producing pulp and paper rather than lumber, while others specialised in processing smaller logs and previously unusable species. These changes required new technologies and different skills from workers, creating both opportunities and challenges for families that had depended on traditional lumber industry employment for generations. Some workers successfully made the transition to paper mill operations, while others sought employment in Ottawa's expanding construction and manufacturing sectors. The river drives that had once been spectacular annual events gradually became smaller and less frequent as transportation patterns shifted toward railways and roads. The last great timber raft passed through Ottawa in 1908, marking the end of an era that had defined the city's character for nearly a century. Yet the lumber industry's decline didn't represent economic disaster for Ottawa, because other industries and government employment had grown to replace traditional sources of jobs and income. The city's economy was becoming more diversified and stable, though perhaps less colourful than during the boom years of the timber trade. Manufacturing enterprises established during this period took advantage of Ottawa's railway connections and proximity to government markets. Firms producing furniture, machinery, and consumer goods found that location in the capital provided advantages in securing contracts while offering access to skilled workers. These industrial developments created employment opportunities for immigrants and displaced lumber workers, while contributing to Ottawa's tax base and economic vitality. Factory jobs often paid better than traditional lumber industry employment, while providing more regular hours and safer working conditions. Labour organisations that had emerged during the 1890s became more sophisticated and influential during the early 20th century. Unions representing construction workers, factory employees, and even some government workers began coordinating their activities and advocating for improved wages and working conditions. These labour movements faced opposition from employers who were accustomed to operating with minimal interference from workers, but they also gained support from reformers who viewed better working conditions as essential for social progress. Strikes and labour disputes became regular features of Ottawa's industrial life, creating tensions that sometimes disrupted the orderly atmosphere that government officials preferred. However, these conflicts also demonstrated the growing strength and organisation of Ottawa's working class. The federal government found itself in complex situations during labour disputes, trying to maintain neutrality while ensuring that essential services continued to operate. The capital city's role as both a centre of political power and an industrial community created conflicts of interest that required careful navigation. As Ottawa entered the second decade of the 20th century, the city had successfully established itself as Canada's permanent capital while developing a diversified economy that provided stability and growth opportunities. The transformation from lumber town to government centre was largely complete, but new challenges were emerging that would test the community's adaptability once again. The approach of World War I would bring unprecedented demands on federal government operations while creating new economic opportunities and social tensions. Ottawa would need to mobilise resources for a global conflict while managing the domestic changes that war would bring to Canadian society. The city that had reinvented itself from frontier settlement to lumber town to capital would soon discover that its transformation was entering yet another phase, one that would reshape not only Ottawa but the entire nation it served. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 transformed Ottawa almost overnight from a peaceful capital into the nerve centre of a nation at war. The quiet government offices that had processed routine administrative matters suddenly became command centres coordinating Canada's contribution to a global conflict that would reshape the entire world. Within weeks of the war's declaration, Parliament Hill buzzed with unprecedented activity as ministers and civil servants worked around the clock to mobilise resources for overseas service. The East Bloc housed military planning operations, while temporary buildings sprouted across the capital to accommodate the rapidly expanding wartime bureaucracy. The war created employment opportunities that drew thousands of new residents to Ottawa. Munitions factories established operations in the city, taking advantage of railway connections and proximity to government decision-makers. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling clerical positions vacated by men who had enlisted for overseas service. The Dominion Arsenal, established in the city's East End, became one of Canada's largest munitions producers, employing thousands of workers who manufactured artillery shells and other military supplies. The factory operated continuously, with shifts working around the clock to meet the insatiable demands of trench warfare in Europe. These industrial developments brought prosperity to many Ottawa families, while also creating new social tensions. Housing shortages became acute as the population swelled with war workers and their families. Rents skyrocketed in neighbourhoods near the munitions plants, while overcrowding became common in working-class areas. The federal government responded by constructing temporary housing projects, but these emergency measures couldn't keep pace with demand. Many families found themselves living in conditions that were barely adequate, despite earning higher wages than ever before. Food prices rose dramatically as agricultural products were diverted to support Allied forces overseas. Rationing became common, while victory gardens appeared in backyards and vacant lots throughout the city. These wartime measures affected all residents, but hit working-class families particularly hard. The war also intensified existing ethnic and linguistic tensions within Ottawa's diverse population. German Canadians faced suspicion and sometimes outright hostility from neighbours who questioned their loyalty. Several German-owned businesses were boycotted, while German cultural organisations suspended their activities to avoid controversy. French-Canadian attitudes toward the war created additional complications for a capital city that prided itself on bilingual harmony. Support for the war effort varied significantly between English and French communities, with conscription debates becoming particularly heated as casualties mounted overseas. The introduction of conscription in 1917 nearly tore the country apart, and Ottawa found itself at the centre of bitter disputes that sometimes erupted into public demonstrations and confrontations. Military police patrolled government buildings, while politicians debated policies that would affect every Canadian family. Despite these tensions, the war years demonstrated Ottawa's capacity to serve as an effective national capital during times of crisis. The federal bureaucracy expanded dramatically, creating permanent changes in how government operated and establishing precedents for federal involvement in economic and social policy. Women's roles in Ottawa society changed fundamentally during the war years as they entered occupations that had previously been exclusively male domains. Female clerks, typists, and factory workers became essential to the war effort, while women's organisations coordinated charitable activities and volunteer work that supported military operations. The Ottawa Local Council of Women organised knitting circles that produced thousands of socks and sweaters for soldiers overseas, while other groups raised funds for ambulances and medical supplies. These activities gave women new opportunities for public leadership, while demonstrating their capacity for organisational work. The federal government recognised these contributions by granting women the right to vote in federal elections in 1918, making Ottawa one of the first capitals where women could participate fully in national politics. This achievement reflected broader changes in gender roles that the war had accelerated throughout Canadian society. Educational institutions adapted to wartime conditions by modifying curricula to emphasise practical skills and patriotic themes. The University of Ottawa established training programs for military officers, while technical schools prepared workers for employment in munitions factories and other war-related industries. Religious institutions played crucial roles in maintaining community morale during the difficult war years. Churches of all denominations organised prayer services, charitable activities, and social events that brought residents together, while providing spiritual comfort to families worried about loved ones overseas. The influenza pandemic that swept through Ottawa in 1918 added another layer of crisis to an already stressed community. The disease killed hundreds of residents while overwhelming the city's medical facilities and disrupting essential services. Schools and theatres closed for weeks as authorities struggled to contain the outbreak, while temporary hospitals were established in public buildings to care for the sick. The pandemic struck just as the war was ending, creating a sombre atmosphere that tempered celebrations of victory. The return of soldiers from overseas in 1918 and 19 created new challenges for a city that had been transformed by 4 years of war. Veterans needed employment, housing, and medical care, while their families struggled to readjust to peacetime conditions after years of separation and anxiety. Some veterans found work in the expanding federal bureaucracy, which had grown dramatically during the war and remained larger than before to handle new government responsibilities. Others established small businesses or returned to traditional occupations in construction and manufacturing. The post-war period brought economic uncertainty as munitions factories closed and government spending declined. Unemployment rose sharply in 1919 and 1920, creating hardships for families that had prospered during the war years. Labour unrest became common as workers struggled with inflation and job insecurity, while employers sought to reduce wages and eliminate wartime gains in working conditions. Several major strikes disrupted Ottawa's economy during 1919, reflecting broader tensions that affected cities across Canada. The federal government found itself caught between competing demands from workers and employers, while trying to maintain stability in the national capital. Police intervention in labour disputes became more common, creating resentments that would persist for years. Despite these challenges, the 1920s marked the beginning of a new era of growth and modernisation for Ottawa. The city that had emerged from the war was larger, more diverse, and more sophisticated than the community that had entered the conflict in 1914. Automobile ownership increased dramatically during the 1920s as mass production made cars more affordable for middle-class families. This transportation revolution enabled the development of new suburban neighbourhoods while creating demands for improved roads and parking facilities. The construction of new bridges across the Ottawa River improved connections between Ottawa and Hull, while facilitating the movement of goods and people throughout the region. These infrastructure investments reflected growing confidence in the capital's future prospects. Radio broadcasting began in Ottawa during the early 1920s, bringing news and entertainment into homes while creating new forms of shared cultural experience. Local stations broadcast parliamentary proceedings, allowing residents across the region to follow political debates and government activities. The establishment of the Canadian National Exhibition in Ottawa provided a venue for celebrating the nation's achievements while attracting visitors from across Canada. These events enhanced the capital's profile while generating economic benefits for local businesses. Cultural institutions flourished during the prosperity of the mid-1920s as residents gained more leisure time and disposable income. New theatres opened while existing venues expanded their programming to include motion pictures alongside live performances. The National Gallery of Canada, established in 1913, began acquiring significant collections that documented the country's artistic development while attracting international attention to Ottawa's cultural resources. Sports continued to play important roles in community life, with hockey remaining particularly popular during the winter months. The Ottawa Senators became one of the most successful teams in professional hockey, winning multiple Stanley Cup championships and bringing national recognition to the capital. Summer sports like baseball and tennis gained popularity as new recreational facilities were constructed throughout the city. Golf courses opened in suburban areas, providing leisure opportunities for the growing middle class while demonstrating Ottawa's evolution beyond its working-class origins. The development of Gatineau Park during this period reflected growing interest in outdoor recreation and conservation. The federal government began acquiring land north of the city to create a protected area that would provide recreational opportunities while preserving natural landscapes for future generations. These park developments enhanced Ottawa's appeal as a place to live, while providing venues for activities that brought together residents from different social and economic backgrounds. Hiking, skiing and camping became popular pastimes that took advantage of the region's natural setting. The lumber industry that had created Ottawa continued its gradual decline during the 1920s, though paper mills and other forest products operations maintained significant employment in the region. The economic base had diversified sufficiently that this transition occurred without major disruption to community prosperity. Manufacturing enterprises established during the war years adapted to peacetime production, creating consumer goods and industrial products that served both local and national markets. These industries provided employment while contributing to Ottawa's economic stability. The federal government's role in Ottawa's development became more systematic during the 1920s, as authorities recognised the importance of maintaining an attractive and functional capital city. The Federal District Commission, established in 1927, began coordinating planning efforts across municipal boundaries. This regional approach to development reflected growing understanding that Ottawa's success as a capital required cooperation between different levels of government and coordination of various planning initiatives. The Commission's work laid foundations for comprehensive urban planning that would guide the city's growth for decades. Immigration patterns during the 1920s brought new ethnic communities to Ottawa while reinforcing the city's multicultural character. Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European families established themselves in various neighbourhoods, adding to the cultural diversity that had become one of Ottawa's defining characteristics. These immigrant communities often clustered in particular areas of the city, creating ethnic enclaves that maintained Old World traditions while adapting to Canadian conditions. Their presence enriched Ottawa's cultural life, while also creating new businesses and community organisations. The construction of new residential neighbourhoods during the 1920s reflected both population growth and changing lifestyle preferences. Middle-class families increasingly sought homes with modern conveniences like electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating, while suburban locations offered more space and privacy than traditional urban neighbourhoods. These developments were facilitated by improved transportation systems, including expanded streetcar networks and growing automobile ownership. The ability to live farther from work locations enabled the development of residential areas that were distinct from commercial and industrial districts. Women's participation in Ottawa's workforce stabilised during the 1920s at levels higher than before the war, though many women had returned to domestic roles after veterans reclaimed civilian employment. Those who remained in paid work often faced restrictions and wage discrimination that reflected persistent attitudes about gender roles. Nevertheless, women's organisations remained active in promoting social reforms and cultural activities that enhanced community life. The Ottawa Local Council of Women continued advocating for improvements in public health, education, and working conditions while supporting various charitable causes. The federal civil service continued expanding during the 1920s as government responsibilities grew, and new departments were created to address emerging social and economic challenges. These positions offered security and respectability while attracting educated workers from across Canada. Civil service employment became particularly attractive to women and members of linguistic minorities who found opportunities for advancement that might not have existed in private sector organisations. The federal government's commitment to bilingual services created advantages for French-speaking Canadians, while encouraging linguistic diversity. Professional associations representing civil servants became more influential during this period, advocating for improved working conditions and pension benefits while establishing standards for government employment. These organisations contributed to Ottawa's reputation as a centre of public administration expertise. The expansion of government operations attracted businesses that specialised in serving federal departments and agencies. Legal firms, consulting companies, and professional services established operations in Ottawa to take advantage of proximity to major clients while contributing to the city's economic diversification. As the 1920s drew to a close, Ottawa had successfully completed another phase of its remarkable transformation. The city that had begun as a lumber town and evolved into a government centre was now becoming a modern metropolitan area with diverse economic foundations and sophisticated cultural institutions. The challenges of the Great Depression that began in 1929 would test this progress in ways that nobody could have anticipated, but Ottawa's experience during the war and post-war years had demonstrated its capacity for adaptation and resilience. The capital that would enter the 1930s bore little resemblance to the rough frontier settlement that had been selected as Canada's seat of government 70 years earlier. Yet it retained the spirit of innovation and determination that had enabled its extraordinary journey from wilderness outpost to national capital, post to national capital. The stock market crash of October 1929 sent shockwaves through financial centres around the world, but Ottawa's residents initially believed their city might be insulated from the worst effects of the economic catastrophe that was about to unfold. After all, government employment provided steady paychecks that didn't depend on stock prices or commodity markets, and the federal civil service had grown large enough to support thousands of families regardless of what happened on Wall Street. This confidence proved tragically misplaced. Within months of the crash, unemployment began rising throughout the Ottawa region as private businesses failed and construction projects were cancelled. The lumber and paper mills that still employed thousands of workers reduced their operations or shut down entirely as demand for their products evaporated. Manufacturing plants that had thrived during the prosperous 20s suddenly found themselves without customers. The federal government, facing its own fiscal crisis as tax revenues plummeted, imposed hiring freezes and salary cuts that affected civil servants who had considered their positions secure. Departments that had expanded rapidly during the previous decade were forced to eliminate positions and reduce services, creating uncertainty even within the supposedly stable world of government employment. By 1932, an estimated quarter of Ottawa's workforce was unemployed, and many more were working reduced hours or accepting pay cuts just to keep their jobs. Bread lines formed outside churches and community centres, while families that had enjoyed middle-class comfort just a few years earlier found themselves struggling to pay rent and buy groceries. The psychological impact of the Depression was perhaps even more devastating than the economic hardship. Ottawa had prided itself on steady progress and growing prosperity, but suddenly the future seemed uncertain and threatening. Young people who had expected to find good jobs and build successful careers faced the prospect of indefinite unemployment or underemployment. Housing became a critical problem as families lost their homes to foreclosure or were evicted for non-payment of rent. Makeshift camps sprouted in vacant lots and along the Ottawa River, housing men who had travelled to the capital seeking work that didn't exist. These Hoovervilles, named after the American president who was blamed for the economic crisis, became visible symbols of the Depression's impact on ordinary people. The federal government struggled to respond to the crisis with tools and policies that had never been tested during peacetime emergencies of this magnitude. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett's administration experimented with relief programs and public works projects. but these efforts seemed inadequate compared to the scale of suffering and dislocation. Ottawa became a focal point for protest movements as unemployed men from across Canada converged on the capital demanding government action. The most dramatic of these demonstrations was the On to Ottawa Trek of 1935, when thousands of relief camp workers began marching eastward from British Columbia, picking up supporters in every city they passed through. The trek was stopped by police in Regina before it could reach the capital, but the confrontation that resulted highlighted the tensions between government authorities and citizens who felt abandoned by their political leaders. The violence that erupted during the Regina riot shocked Canadians and contributed to the defeat of Bennett's Conservative government in the election that followed. These events transformed Ottawa's political atmosphere in ways that extended far beyond specific policy debates. The city that had once seemed removed from the economic struggles affecting other parts of Canada suddenly found itself at the centre of conflicts about the role of government and the responsibilities of the state toward its citizens. Relief programs administered by federal and municipal authorities provided essential assistance to thousands of families, but they also created new forms of social tension and stigma. Recipients of government aid often faced intrusive investigations of their personal lives and restrictions on their behaviour that reflected prevailing attitudes about the deserving and undeserving poor. Women bore particular burdens during the Depression years, as traditional gender roles were disrupted by unemployment and economic hardship. Many women entered the workforce for the first time out of economic necessity, often accepting jobs that paid less than what their unemployed husbands had previously earned. The expansion of women's employment during the Depression created opportunities but also generated resentment from men who felt that jobs should go to male breadwinners first. These tensions played out in workplaces, union halls, and government offices throughout the capital, reflecting broader social anxieties about changing gender roles. Religious institutions played crucial roles in providing both material assistance and spiritual comfort during the darkest years of the Depression. Churches of all denominations operated soup kitchens and clothing distribution centres, while organising charitable activities that brought communities together in mutual support. The United Church of Canada, formed through the merger of Methodist, Presbyterian and Congregational denominations in 1925, became particularly active in social welfare work during the Depression. Their commitment to the social gospel movement led to advocacy for government programs that would address the root causes of poverty and unemployment. Catholic institutions also expanded their social services, drawing on traditions of charitable work while adapting to the unprecedented scale of need during the economic crisis. The Church's emphasis on family values and community solidarity resonated with many residents who felt that traditional institutions were more reliable than government programs. Educational institutions faced severe budget constraints during the Depression as both government funding and private donations declined. Schools eliminated programs and reduced staff while trying to serve growing numbers of students whose families could no longer afford private alternatives. The University of Ottawa struggled to maintain its operations as enrolment declined and research funding disappeared. Faculty members accepted pay cuts while taking on additional teaching responsibilities, and many promising research projects were abandoned due to lack of resources. Despite these challenges, educational institutions also served as centres of intellectual ferment where new ideas about economics, politics, and social policy were debated and developed. Faculty and students engaged in discussions about the causes of the Depression and potential solutions that would influence Canadian policy for decades to come. Cultural institutions similarly faced financial difficulties while also serving as refugees from the harsh realities of economic hardship. Libraries experienced increased usage as people sought free entertainment and educational opportunities, while theatres and concert halls struggled to attract audiences who could no longer afford tickets. The National Gallery of Canada reduced its acquisitions and eliminated staff positions, but it also began developing more accessible programming that would introduce art to broader audiences. Free exhibitions and educational programs demonstrated the institution's commitment to serving the entire community rather than just cultural elites. Radio broadcasting became increasingly important during the Depression as families sought inexpensive entertainment and reliable sources of news about economic developments. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, established in 1936, began operations with a mandate to serve all Canadians while promoting national unity and cultural development. Local radio stations in Ottawa provided forums for political debate and community discussion while broadcasting cultural programming that helped maintain morale during difficult times. These broadcasts created shared experiences that brought together residents from different neighbourhoods and social backgrounds. Sports continued to provide diversion from economic worries, though professional teams struggled with reduced attendance and financial constraints. The Ottawa Senators hockey team, despite their previous success, faced mounting debts and was eventually sold and relocated to other cities, depriving the capital of one of its most beloved institutions. Amateur sports and recreational activities became more important as people sought low-cost entertainment options. Skating on the Rideau Canal, hiking in Gatineau Park, and neighbourhood baseball leagues provided opportunities for physical activity and social interaction that didn't require significant financial resources. The construction industry, which had been a major source of employment during Ottawa's growth periods, virtually collapsed during the early years of the Depression. Building projects were cancelled, workers were laid off, and construction companies went bankrupt, eliminating thousands of jobs that had supported immigrant families and skilled tradesmen. Government efforts to stimulate employment through public works projects provided some relief, but these initiatives were often delayed by political debates about spending priorities and fiscal responsibility. The construction of new government buildings and infrastructure improvements created jobs, but not nearly enough to replace all the positions that had been eliminated in the private sector. Manufacturing enterprises that had established operations in Ottawa during the previous decades faced similar challenges as demand for their products declined and credit became unavailable. Some companies survived by diversifying their production or finding new markets, while others simply ceased operations and sold their equipment. The lumber and paper industries, which had been gradually declining since their peak decades earlier, experienced additional pressures during the Depression as construction activity declined and international markets contracted. Mill closures eliminated hundreds of jobs in communities that had few alternative sources of employment. Labour organisations that had gained strength during the 1920s found their influence diminished as unemployment gave employers increased leverage in wage negotiations. Union membership declined as workers feared losing their jobs if they engaged in collective action, while strike activity decreased dramatically compared to previous decades. Nevertheless, some labour leaders argued that the Depression demonstrated the need for more fundamental changes in the economic system rather than simply accepting temporary hardship. These discussions contributed to the development of new political movements that would influence Canadian politics for generations. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, formed in 1932, attracted support from Ottawa residents who believed that democratic socialism offered solutions to the economic crisis that capitalism had created. The party's emphasis on public ownership and social planning resonated with civil servants and intellectuals who had witnessed the failures of unregulated markets. Political debates during the Depression years were particularly intense in Ottawa because residents could observe government decision-making processes firsthand while also experiencing the consequences of those decisions in their daily lives. The proximity to political power created both opportunities for influence and frustrations when policies seemed inadequate or misdirected. The election of William Lyon. Mackenzie King's Liberal government in 1935 brought new approaches to economic policy that would have lasting impacts on Ottawa's development. King's administration was more willing to use federal spending to stimulate economic activity, while also experimenting with social programs that would provide security for vulnerable populations. These policy changes required significant expansions of the federal bureaucracy, creating employment opportunities for educated workers while establishing precedents for government involvement in economic and social affairs. Ottawa's role as the administrative centre for these new programs enhanced its importance as a national capital, while also diversifying its economic base. The gradual recovery that began in the mid-1930s was slow and uneven, with setbacks that reminded residents how precarious their economic situation remained. However, by 1937, unemployment had declined significantly, and construction activity was beginning to revive as confidence in the future slowly returned. The approach of another world war created additional uncertainties, but also opportunities for economic revival as government spending on defence preparations stimulated manufacturing and construction activities. The lessons learned during the Depression about the role of government in managing economic crises would prove invaluable as Canada prepared for another period of national mobilisation. Women's organisations that had provided essential services during the worst years of the Depression continued their advocacy for social reforms that would prevent future hardships. Their experience during the economic crisis had demonstrated both their organisational capabilities and their importance to community survival. The Ottawa Local Council of Women and similar organisations had evolved from charitable societies into sophisticated advocacy groups that understood how to influence government policy and mobilise public opinion. Their work during the Depression laid foundations for the expansion of social programs that would become central features of Canadian society. Immigration to Ottawa virtually ceased during the Depression as economic opportunities disappeared and government policies discouraged new arrivals. The ethnic communities that had established themselves during previous decades focused on survival and mutual support rather than expansion and integration. However, these communities also demonstrated remarkable resilience and solidarity during the crisis, creating informal networks of assistance that helped members weather the economic storm. Cultural organisations and religious institutions provided both practical support and emotional comfort that sustained community morale during the darkest years. The experience of the Depression fundamentally changed Ottawa's character in ways that extended far beyond economic policy and government programs. The city that emerged from the crisis was more aware of its vulnerabilities while also more confident in its capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. The rough lumber town that had become a government centre and then a modern metropolitan area had now proven its ability to survive economic catastrophe while maintaining its essential functions and community spirit. The lessons learned during the 1930s would shape Ottawa's approach to future challenges while reinforcing its identity as a resilient and adaptable capital city. As the decade drew to a close and war clouds gathered once again over Europe, Ottawa residents could look back on the Depression years with a mixture of painful memories and quiet pride. They had endured hardships that had tested every aspect of their community, yet they had emerged with institutions and relationships that were stronger and more inclusive than before. The capital city that would enter World War II bore the scars of economic struggle, but also possessed hard-won wisdom about the importance of collective action and mutual support. The transformation from lumber town to national capital had required multiple reinventions, and the Depression had proven that Ottawa's capacity for adaptation remained as strong as ever. The federal government's expanded role in economic and social policy, developed in response to the crisis of the 1930s, would become permanent features of Canadian governance, making Ottawa even more central to the nation's development. The city that had once seemed like an unlikely choice for a national capital had demonstrated time and again its ability to serve that role effectively under the most challenging circumstances. Most challenging circumstances. The declaration of war on September 10, 1939, once again transformed Ottawa from a capital still recovering from economic hardship into the command centre of a nation preparing for total war. But this time, the mobilisation would be different from anything Canada had experienced before. The lessons learned during the First World War and the administrative capacity built during the Depression would enable a scale of organisation and production that dwarfed previous efforts. Within days of the war declaration, Parliament Hill became a hive of activity that made the frantic pace of 1914 seem leisurely by comparison. New government departments sprouted almost overnight to coordinate everything from munitions production to food rationing, while existing ministries expanded their operations exponentially. Temporary buildings appeared across the capital like mushrooms after rain, housing the rapidly growing wartime bureaucracy. The transformation was visible everywhere. Office buildings that had stood half empty during the worst years of the Depression suddenly overflowed with clerks, typists, and administrators working around the clock to process the paperwork of war. Parking became impossible as government workers flooded into the city, while restaurants and boarding houses struggled to accommodate the influx of new residents. This time, the federal government was determined to avoid the chaotic mobilisation that had characterised the earlier conflict. Systematic planning replaced improvisation, while new agencies coordinated production and distribution with unprecedented efficiency. The Department of Munitions and Supply, established under the dynamic leadership of C.D. Howe, became one of the most powerful organisations in Canadian history. Ottawa's industrial capacity expanded dramatically as factories converted to war production or built entirely new facilities to meet military requirements. The city that had once depended primarily on lumber and government employment now hosted sophisticated manufacturing operations, producing everything from aircraft engines to electronic equipment. Women entered the workforce in numbers that made their participation during the First World War seem modest by comparison. They operated machinery in munitions plants, served as air raid wardens, and filled clerical positions throughout the expanding government bureaucracy. The sight of women in coveralls working alongside men in factories became commonplace, challenging traditional assumptions about gender roles in ways that would have lasting consequences. The National Research Council, headquartered in Ottawa, became a centre of scientific innovation that contributed to Allied victory through developments in radar, communications, and weapons technology. The city's universities and technical institutes collaborated closely with government researchers, creating an atmosphere of intellectual excitement that attracted scientists and engineers from around the world. Housing shortages became even more severe than during the First World War as the population swelled with war workers and their families. Government housing projects sprouted in areas that had been farmland just months earlier, while existing neighbourhoods were subdivided and converted to accommodate maximum occupancy. Families that had lived comfortably in single-family homes found themselves sharing space with strangers who worked different shifts in the same factories. The war effort created a sense of shared purpose that bridged many of the social divisions that had characterised Ottawa during peacetime. English and French Canadians worked side by side in munitions plants, while recent immigrants demonstrated their loyalty through service in war industries and volunteer organisations. The ethnic tensions that had sometimes flared during previous decades seemed to dissolve in the face of a common enemy. Food rationing and victory gardens became features of daily life that reminded residents constantly of their connection to a global conflict. Neighbourhood committees organised scrap metal drives and war bond campaigns, while school children collected materials for recycling and participated in mock air raid drills that brought the reality of war into every classroom. The blackout regulations that darkened Ottawa's streets after sunset created an atmosphere that would have been unimaginable during peacetime. The city that had prided itself on modern electric lighting now concealed its presence from potential enemy aircraft, while air raid wardens patrolled neighbourhoods to ensure compliance with regulations that seemed surreal in the heart of North America. Cultural institutions adapted their programming to support the war effort while maintaining morale on the home front. Theatres staged patriotic productions and variety shows for military audiences, while the National Gallery organised exhibitions that celebrated Canadian achievements and democratic values. Radio programming included regular updates from the battlefronts alongside entertainment that provided temporary escape from wartime anxieties. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, still in its early years, became a vital link between Ottawa and the rest of the country during the war. Parliamentary debates about military strategy and wartime policies were broadcast to audiences across Canada, while special programs kept families informed about loved ones serving overseas. Sports took on new significance as both entertainment and symbols of normalcy during wartime disruption. Hockey games provided opportunities for community gatherings that maintained civilian morale, while athletic competitions in factories and military bases promoted physical fitness and team spirit among war workers and service personnel. The lumber industry, which had seemed to be entering terminal decline during the Depression, experienced an unexpected revival as military construction projects demanded enormous quantities of wood products. Sawmills that had closed during the economic crisis reopened to meet wartime demands, while paper mills converted their production to military specifications for packaging and communications materials. Labour relations during the war years were complicated by competing pressures to maximise production while maintaining worker loyalty and preventing strikes that might disrupt essential services. Union membership grew dramatically as employment expanded, but strike activity was discouraged through patriotic appeals and government mediation that emphasised shared sacrifice for the national cause. The federal civil service underwent transformations that would permanently alter its character and role in Canadian society. Departments that had employed hundreds of workers before the war now supervised thousands, while new agencies created during the conflict established precedents for government involvement in economic planning and social policy that would continue long after peace returned. Women's participation in government employment reached levels that would have been inconceivable before the war, though they continued to face wage discrimination and restrictions on advancement that reflected persistent attitudes about gender roles. Nevertheless, their demonstration of competence in positions of responsibility created expectations and opportunities that would influence post-war developments. The international character of wartime Ottawa became apparent as Allied governments established liaison offices and diplomatic missions that brought foreign officials and military personnel to the capital. Embassy Row expanded to accommodate representatives from countries across the British Empire and Allied nations, while refugee intellectuals and scientists found temporary homes in the city's expanding research community. These international connections enhanced Ottawa's profile as a world capital, while also exposing residents to perspectives and ideas that broadened their understanding of global affairs. The city that had once seemed provincial and isolated, was becoming cosmopolitan in ways that reflected Canada's growing importance on the world stage. Victory gardens sprouted in every available space as residents responded to government campaigns encouraging food production and conservation. Parks, schoolyards, and private lawns were converted to vegetable plots that supplemented ration supplies while demonstrating civilian commitment to the war effort. These gardens became sources of community pride and neighbourhood cooperation that strengthened social bonds during stressful times. The war years also saw significant developments in Ottawa's transportation infrastructure as military requirements and industrial expansion created demands that existing systems couldn't meet. New roads connected manufacturing districts with residential areas, while improved railway facilities handled the massive increase in freight traffic generated by war production. The Ottawa River, which had once carried timber rafts and provided recreational opportunities, now hosted military training exercises and industrial transportation that reflected the waterway's strategic importance. Patrol boats monitored river traffic for security threats, while docks and warehouses handled military supplies destined for overseas shipment. Children growing up in wartime Ottawa experienced a childhood unlike any previous generation, surrounded by reminders of global conflict while participating in activities that prepared them for adult responsibilities. School curricula emphasized practical skills and patriotic themes, while youth organizations focused on physical fitness and community service that would support the war effort. The approach of victory in Europe during 1945 created anticipation mixed with anxiety about what peace might bring. Families worried about the adjustment challenges facing returning veterans, while communities wondered whether wartime prosperity and employment would survive the transition to peacetime production. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to a sudden conclusion that left many residents struggling to comprehend the implications of nuclear weapons for future international relations. The celebration of victory was tempered by awareness that the world had entered a new and potentially more dangerous era. Demobilization proceeded more smoothly than after the First World War, reflecting better planning and expanded government programs designed to ease veterans' transition to civilian life. Educational benefits, job training programs, and housing assistance helped returning service members find their places in a peacetime economy that had been fundamentally transformed by 6 years of war. The Ottawa that emerged from World War II bore little resemblance to the city that had entered the conflict in 1939. The population had grown dramatically. The industrial base had diversified beyond recognition, and the federal government had assumed responsibilities that made it a permanent presence in Canadian economic and social life. Women's roles had changed in ways that couldn't be easily reversed, despite pressure to return to traditional domestic responsibilities. Many women had discovered capabilities and interests that peacetime society would struggle to accommodate, creating tensions that would influence gender relations for decades to come. The scientific and technological capabilities developed during the war positioned Ottawa as a centre of research and innovation that would attract continued investment and talent during the post-war period. The National Research Council and university-based research programs had demonstrated their value in ways that ensured ongoing government support for scientific advancement. The wartime expansion of government operations had created a federal bureaucracy that was both larger and more sophisticated than anything previously imagined. These administrative capabilities would prove essential as Canada assumed greater international responsibilities while also developing domestic programs that addressed social and economic challenges revealed during the Depression and war years. As Ottawa residents celebrated victory and began planning for peacetime reconstruction, they could take pride in their community's contributions to Allied success, while also recognizing that their city had been permanently transformed by the experience of total war. The lumber town that had become a government centre and survived economic depression had now proven its capacity to serve as the nerve centre of a middle power with global ambitions and responsibilities. The challenges of the post-war world would test Ottawa's adaptability once again, but the experience of the war years had demonstrated the community's remarkable capacity for growth and change. The capital city that would enter the second half of the 20th century possessed resources and capabilities that would enable it to play an increasingly important role in Canadian development and international affairs. The transformation from frontier settlement to modern capital was complete in all but the final details, yet the spirit of innovation and determination that had characterized Ottawa's entire history remained as strong as ever. The city that had reinvented itself repeatedly over the course of a century was ready to embrace whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. Challenges and opportunities the future might bring. From the ancient indigenous settlements along the Kichissippi to the gleaming towers of the modern federal district, Ottawa's journey has been nothing short of extraordinary. What began as seasonal camps beside rushing waters became a rough lumber town where fortunes were made and lost with the spring river drives. That frontier community transformed into an unlikely capital chosen by a distant queen, then evolved into the sophisticated seat of government we know today. Through devastating fires and economic collapse, through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, Ottawa has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for reinvention. The city has weathered each crisis not by clinging to what it was, but by embracing what it needed to become. The timber barons who built mansions overlooking the Ottawa River gave way to civil servants who filled expanding government offices. The rough-hewn loggers who once drove logs through treacherous rapids were succeeded by skilled workers who manufactured munitions and scientific equipment for global conflicts. Yet beneath all these transformations, something essential has remained constant. Ottawa has always been a place where ordinary people could build extraordinary lives, where diverse communities could find common purpose, and where the future seemed possible even in the darkest times. The spirit of innovation that drove Philemon Wright to see timber wealth in an untamed wilderness still animates the researchers and policymakers who work in today's capital. As Ottawa continues to evolve in the 21st century, facing new challenges and opportunities that its founders could never have imagined, the lessons of its remarkable history remain relevant. This city has proven time and again that transformation is not only possible, but inevitable, and that the communities willing to adapt and grow are the ones that endure and thrive. The lumber town that became a capital has become something even greater, a testament to the power of human determination and the endless possibilities that emerge when people refuse to accept limitations on their dreams.